Hi everyone, welcome again to Gamel Facebook Live. I'm back. My name is Heather Cartwright. I am the Gamel dealer for Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. We are Highland Gamel. And this quilt might look a little bit familiar to some of you, 10,000 of you. Thank you so much for making my first ever Facebook Live a huge success. Thank you for watching it and sharing it with your friends. The first Facebook video, we showed you how to applique with Minky using the Statler without having to trace any letters or iron anything on. And today I am going to show you how I quilt the remainder of the quilt. I had a lot of people ask me what pattern I used. It's just a very simple pattern that I drew up quickly. So I'm going to show you today how to make an edge-to-edge pattern out of a simple geometric shape and how I used it on this quilt. So come on up to the screen. Today we're working on the Statler, and to begin I'm going to make an edge-to-edge pattern. So to do that I start by creating a boundary, and I click pattern boundary, and I'm going to come over here and click the top left hand corner of my quilt, the top right hand corner. I'm basically just clicking all the corners clear to the bar. I'm telling the computer this is my quiltable space. Well, I probably clicked something wrong because it's live. That happens. Let's try this again. Click my second boundary point and down to the bar and back. All right, much better. All right, and cancel. I have my square on my screen. That's my quilting area. I'm going to hit exit drawing. And now I can tell where my needle is by watching these crosshairs. So as I move my machine around, that is where my needle is going to go down. All right, I'm creating a simple chevron pattern. There is a geometric shape in your Statler patterns that are included with your machine, and it is called geometric triangle border. And it's basically just a little teepee. You could even draw it with the draw line function if you don't have it. And that's the pattern we're going to use today. So when I double click it, it automatically pops over to my project tab. And I'm going to highlight it. And then I'm going to come up here to repeat patterns, because as I set this up, I'm setting it up inside my boundary. And this is the easiest way that I found to do that. So when I click repeat patterns, it asks me to click a point, and what it's asking for is the starting point. So I'm going to come down from the top left corner about 6 inches, and I'm going to click that as my first point. You'll see that one of those little teepees appeared, one of those chevrons. I'm going to come over here. This box also opened, so this is my repeat pattern setup. I'm going to go ahead and first of all unlock my total size, and that will help it, as I add repeats, help it fill in the space that I've given it. So how do I know how many repeats? Well, with Minky, it's a pretty good drawing board. So I can come over here and I can just use my finger. I want this to be very spread out so it's very quickly quilted, just enough to hold this Minky together. So I've drawn 2, 4, 6. We're going to start with 7 chevrons in this pattern. So on my repeats, I'm going to take it up to 7. And then I want 3 rows, and I will tell you why in just a minute.
They say it's hard to hear.
Okay, we got some feedback that it's hard to hear. I will try to talk a little bit louder. Is that better? Okay, I'm clicking OK, and now I'm going to highlight the whole section and drag it out to the edge. So a little tip on highlighting. When you're in CS7, if you start at the top left and you highlight, whatever you want highlighted has to be completely inside the box. So notice how that bottom row was not inside the box completely, so it didn't highlight. If I wanted to highlight this, I would have to go a little bit above and drag a little bit below to get everything. If I start at the bottom, right, and I go up, I just need a little piece of everything to be inside for it to highlight everything. So just a little bit of a tip. I'm going to use my purple handle, and I'm going to drag this across to fill the space, and it looks a little steep for me, so I'm going to highlight the whole thing, drag it out so I only have 6 points, and then I'm going to highlight just this last section and delete it. So this is what I want my chevron pattern to look like. How's the volume, everybody? Is that, somebody give me a thumbs up if you can hear a little bit better. All right, so I have this pattern set up, but you'll notice that each of these is an individual pattern. We don't want tie-offs after each chevron. So the first thing we're going to do is highlight each row and combine the patterns. I can do this by right-clicking and choosing Combine Patterns, or I can do it by simply clicking Combine Patterns up in the top toolbar. You'll notice after I do that, when I click on them, instead of being individual chevrons, they're now a complete row. I'll combine that last row, and then I will set my sew pattern. So right now the computer will start at the left, it will stitch across, pause for me to cut my thread, come over here, stitch across. I would like it to stitch left to right, drop down, right to left, drop down, left to right, and be done. I don't want it to stop at the edges, so I'm going to turn my jump stitch off. So you'll go up and click on Service and Technical Support, Controller Definition. This is your default box, and Stop at Jump Stitch is right in the very center. You'll see that it was turned off. If your jump stitch is turned on, it's going to stop and wait for you to cut your thread every time the pattern stops. So you can go ahead and turn that off by unclicking it, make sure it's a nice empty box, and then come up to File, Save and Close. That will save whatever settings that you have just changed. All right. Now I want to set the sew order. So what I'm going to do is I can do that 2 different ways. I can click on Pattern and Set Sew Order, or you'll see there's a shortcut, F4. So I'll click on Set Sew Order, and when I do so, it pops up in pink where it's going to start. So we have 0, 1, 2, and they're all going left to right, and you can tell by those arrows at the end. So if I want to change that, I always start with 0, where I want it to start. It turns blue, telling me that this sew order has been set. I want it to drop down, and when you want to change directions, you simply click on the arrow, and it changes the direction of the stitching, and then I can click 1. It turns blue, so I know that line is set. Then I come down here and click on 2, and it turns blue. So now I know it's going to start at 0, it's going to come across to the right, drop down, come across to the left, drop down, and go back to the right. Now the reason I picked 3, first of all, let's save this. So we save it by, again, Pattern, Set Sew Order, or Set Sew Order, or this time I'm going to just click F4, and it saves it and exits out of the Set Sew Order. Now I have 3 rows. I have my order set. I want to combine them into one pattern. So I'm going to highlight the whole thing and hit Combine Patterns. Now when I click on anywhere in this pattern, it's just one pattern. Now the reason I chose 3 rows is because I like for this to end on the right hand side, simply because this particular pattern is going to start up here on the top left and it's going to end at the bottom right. So it's not a good candidate for end of set when you roll your quilt, which is probably what most of you use. So when I try to use this as an edge to edge, it will prompt me to use the place 2 pins method, which is just fine. If you've never used place 2 pins, you will get to learn how to do that today. So now that I have it as one complete pattern, I'm ready to save it. I highlight the pattern, right click, and hit choose Save Pattern. You'll see the box pop up and I can decide what I want to name it. I'm going to name this one Minky Chevron Quilt. I want to save it as an edge to edge because that's how I'm going to use it. Not a point to point, it's not a border. And I'm going to add a tag chevron, and I'm going to add a tag Minky. That way if I forget what I named it, I surely can find it. I will save and close, and you'll notice when I do that, the Minky Chevron quilt pattern pops up in my project tab automatically, which is wonderful because we're going to use it right now. I will open a new quilt group, and to start my edge to edge, I will highlight the new pattern I just created and I will hit edge to edge. Then I'm going to follow the prompts on the screen. So I'm going to set up my edge to edge by clicking the top left corner of my quilt and then move over to the top right corner. Bring it all the way down as far as I can on the right hand side and then back to the bottom left corner. The next thing it asked me is for the quilt length. Now in this particular quilt, I use 60 wide minky. I want to subtract an inch on each end. So I'm going to enter the quilt length at 58 inches. I just type it in the length and hit enter. Here's my warning that this pattern is not appropriate for end of set. It's recommended that we use place 2 pins. So I'm going to click yes, that's fine with me. And here is my pattern all ready to stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And I want to make sure I don't need to trim out any of this lettering to begin. So I'm going to put my needle at the very top of that letter, and then I'm going to check my screen, and you'll see that this first swipe is going to completely miss the lettering. So I'm going to go ahead, and I want to make sure I had my needle turned off for a minute there. So I'm going to turn my needle up. I already did that. Okay. And I'm going to start quilting. It's going to go to the beginning spot, and I'm going to pull up my bobbin thread and hit start. Once it gets going, I usually just snip off that thread and throw it on the floor. Just kidding, put it in the garbage can. While that's quilting, I wanted to answer a few questions about, I know it's probably going to be hard to hear, about binding with the minky. So I had several of you ask how I bind the quilt. Look over here. I usually do one of two things. I'll either wrap the backing around to the front, or I will make a binding entirely out of minky. So if I'm wrapping it around, the first thing I do when I take it off the machine is I trim the batting and the minky off right up to the edge of my basting stitch. Then I trim my backing about 2 inches out from the basting stitch. That way I can, I'm going to take this quilt clip off. I can roll it into the edge and then roll it again and stitch it down, and I get a nice clean edge. When I stitch it down, I like to use my walking foot because minky, this is a pretty thick area right here, and I come in about 1/8 of an inch so that I am sure to catch the fabric, because you have little hairs here, and if you just stitch the hairs, it's not going to stay very well. So if I and then I also, I don't know if I said this, I unpick the basting stitch if I'm going to wrap that around, because I don't want 2 stitches in the back of it. If I make a minky binding, I cut a 3-inch strip of minky and I sew it on just like you would a regular binding, but I don't double it first. So I just stitch it to the back and then bring it up around the front and do the same thing, fold it in, tuck it under, and stitch on top. Do we have any questions?
What batting are you using?
Oh, what batting am I using? My favorite batting to use with minky is the Hobbs Poly Down. So if you'll come over here, this is a thin 6.6 ounce poly batting. It's very soft. It's nice and pliable. It doesn't leave, it doesn't have, crinkles like some poly batting. When you pull it out of a package, you have different widths. It's very even and consistent. And I love using it with minky because they're both made of polyester, so neither of them will shrink. And as you wash the quilt and use it, it will stay very cuddly and really nice. I also really like this batting with flannel. It makes a wonderful batting for flannel quilts. Any other questions? Okay. Well, we're approaching the edge of our quilting pattern where it's going to prompt us to place the 2 pins and roll our quilt. And on the next pass, I'm going to show you how I trim out the lettering when I'm quilting using an edge-to-edge pattern. All right, I like to pull my bobbin up first and snip it off. And then when I hit continue, the computer is asking me, if you want to go show them, click OK to move to the right registration point. So I click OK. And it moves to this point for me. I'm going to put a pin in the side of the quilt where the laser light's showing, right where the needle would go down, and I'm going to click OK. And the machine will automatically move over to the left-hand side. And the screen will prompt me to place a pin when it gets to the left-hand side. After I do that, I can hit OK, and I'm ready to roll my quilt. So I'm going to take the clips off from each end, and we're going to advance the quilt. All right, so I'm going to roll it forward just a little bit and get ready for the next section where we'll trim out the lettering. All right. Put my clamps back on. I lost one. All right. Thank you for being patient. All right. So now we're ready to tell the quilt machine, the computer, that we rolled the quilt. So we're going to go up here to Roll Quilt and click. And it's going to prompt us to mark the left registration mark. So we'll come over to the quilt. And now our pin is up here at the top. We're going to find that same spot, click OK. It prompts us to move to the right registration point. We're going to do that and click OK. And then you'll see on the screen, it's moved our quilting pattern down to the next section. It's black, so that means it's ready to quilt. And now we're ready to trim out our lettering. To do that, I'm going to go up here to the Draw Trim feature. And there's a little drop down here that tells me if I'm trimming the inside or I'm trimming the outside. I want to trim the inside of the shape I draw, so we're good. I'm going to click on Draw Trim. And I'm going to take the machine head and start at the top left-hand corner of my lettering. And each time I push the button, I tell it where this lettering is, and I'm telling it not to quilt in this particular area. I'm not too worried about the top because I'm going to make sure the chevrons don't interfere with the top, but I am a little concerned about the sides, and that's why I trimmed out just the sides of the huskies down here. And I'm going to just go kind of along the edge of my S and then across the bottom and along the side of my H, back up to the E. So I've made kind of a block, paying most attention to the right and left hand side. Now when I hit close drawing, you'll see on the screen that it's just blanked out where I told it not to quilt. So a couple of things. Up here, this first row is going to stop here and take some tie-off stitches after each little chevron. I don't really want that to happen. So I'm going to exit my drawing, and I'm going to manipulate this pattern just a little bit so that we don't have that trim out, so it sits just above. Now, you'll see me scrolling on the screen, and in case you didn't know this, when you use the roller on your mouse, the roller ball, if your cursor is up in the top left-hand corner and you scroll away from you, it's going to use that top left-hand corner as a constant and push the pattern down. Same as if you scroll towards you, it will bring it up. The same goes with if your mouse is over here, the same way. So that's an easy way to change the dynamics of your screen when you need to enlarge something. So I'm going to make sure I can see the whole thing, and I'm just going to actually highlight that quiltable spot right there, and I'm going to move just that one up a little bit because on this quilt we're not even going to be able to tell. I might actually, I'll just actually move this one up just a hair so that it's a little less noticeable. But now if you can see, we aren't going to stop and have tie-off stitches every time it trims across the top. But I'm zooming in. If you can see these, we've got these little tiny tips that are gonna show up, and we don't want those to quilt. So we are gonna use the trim feature again, but this time instead of using the head on the machine, I'm going to use the mouse to trim around those. And I left click around it, right click to close the drawing, then move to the next one, and I can just trim out those little points so they don't get in the way. And this one you can barely even see, but the computer knows it's there. Perfect. All right, looks like we're all ready to quilt. I'm going to exit the drawing and go ahead and start quilting.
I have a question.
Is there a question?
Are you marking on the seam of the letter or just outside of the letters?
I am marking, it's very close. With Minky, you can do either. The stitch line would probably be best because it hides it very well. On a quilt, if it wasn't Minky, I would do the very edge of the fabric or the seam. And then when it gets to that point, you have the ability to manipulate the fabric a little bit to make it land exactly where you want it to land. All right, pull up that bobbin thread and get started. So it'll quilt across, and then as it's coming back, I'll show you how I get it to be perfect when it lands at my trim section. Any other questions? Okay. If we miss a question, we will be going back through the comments after the video, and we'll be sure to answer any questions that you do have. So you'll see we're missing that top, so it's not doing a tie-off. That's just perfect. And I can skip this whole section because there's enough quilting in the letters that I feel comfortable. Nothing's going to come apart or bubble out or anything like that. There's only about 6 inches between this quilting, so I feel fine about that. Okay, we had a question, how much am I asking for the quilt? I used to have a quilt store, and I would make these for people. And if they brought everything in, I would consider this custom quilting. So if you have a long arm quilting business, I would charge them whatever you charge to custom quilt, something like this. If a consumer, okay, oops, sorry, let's show this real quick. So you see how it tied off at the edge of the T. Now it's dragging the thread across. And when it gets to the E, I have the ability to maneuver the quilt if I need to make it start right where I want it to. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and pause so you can hear me a little bit better. If a consumer asked me to make a quilt like this for them, my general rule is materials plus the quilting, and then I double that for my labor. So if I had $100 in material and it was going to cost me $80 to have it quilted, let's say, I would charge $360 for the quilt. So a good general rule, I feel like, for homemade goods is the cost of materials and the cost of quilting is also your labor charge, if that makes sense.
Also, how do you skip the tie-offs?
How do you skip the tie-offs? Okay, if I understand the question right, that it did tie off. If you don't want it to tie off, we can go back in. I'll show you, let's see, I'm gonna let it finish this row and then I'll stop and show you where you would do that. Okay, all right, so to turn off the tie-off stitches, you go up to Service, Technical Support, and Controller Definition. This is where we turned off our jump stitch. You'll see that right here on the left hand side in the center is tie-offs. If you uncheck that, then it will not take tie-off stitches next to your trim. It will just skip from the very last stitch and go on. You can also change the amount of tie-off stitches here as well. So I usually have mine set to 5 because I think 7 is a little bit much. And you can also adjust the tie-off stitches per inch. 43 stitches per inch is like a micro stitch. It's a very good locking stitch. And when you do any changes in the controller definitions, definitely File, Save, and Close to set those. Any other questions pop up? All right, the width of the white strips, and why doesn't that say Kimberly Bulldogs? Ha ha, very funny. I've made a lot of Kimberly Bulldogs quilts, Trace Nichols, in my day, and yeah, we switched from red and black to blue and white and gray. So the strips are about 10 inches for the Emmett Huskies or the Emmett, and I would say that these letters are only about 6 inches on the Huskies. All right, Gamble Quilt. So another question, whatever you charge to, oh, that's my answer. Ha, sorry, kind of new at this, so bear with me. I don't see, let's see, any other questions. So like I said, I will definitely answer more questions as they pop up in the comments as people watch the video. Thank you for viewing. Thank you for sharing. I love sharing fun quilting techniques with all of you. So I appreciate your attention today and want to thank you for tuning in to the Gamble Facebook Lives. Have a really great day. Bye.